This screencast is going to be all about cell division. So what is the cycle of cells dividing and not dividing, and also why do cells divide in the first place? This diagram represents what we call the cell cycle. Basically, eukaryotic cells that are dividing go through this regular cycle where they grow, they duplicate their DNA, because if the cell's going to divide, it needs 2 copies of the DNA, so each new cell will have a copy. They get ready, and then they divide. And then they just repeat. Grow, copy DNA, prepare, divide, grow, copy DNA, repair, divide, etc. So we call this cycle the cell cycle. And here's just a larger picture of what that cycle looks like. Also, note that the size of the sections is a relative representation of how long that section takes. This yellow part, which is the actual dividing, is a very small section of the pie. Most of the time, the cell is not actually actively dividing. It's doing other things. So there's names for these parts of the cell cycle. We can really divide it into 2 basic parts, although there is a further breakdown we can use. But for our purposes, what we need to know is interphase is the part where the cell is not actually dividing, and then M phase is the part where the cell is actually dividing. Based on that pie chart, we can see that the part that the cell is usually in, that it spends most of its time in, is interphase. Also, not every cell is going around and around this cell cycle, this process of dividing. Sometimes cells will take sort of an off-ramp to a phase we can call G0, which means the cell is not actively dividing. Now, this says resting. That doesn't mean that the cell is like not doing anything. It's still doing whatever its job as a cell is. You know, whatever its function is, it's just not in this process of dividing. So some questions to consider. Well, why might a cell do this and stop dividing? And then, like, what kinds of cells would be likely to not be in this cycle of dividing? So here's a hint right here. This cell is a neuron, which is one of the types of cells that we would not expect to be dividing. Basically, once an organism is full grown, so it's not growing anymore, there is a lot of kinds of cells that don't need to divide anymore because the organism doesn't need to get any bigger, so you don't need any more of those cells. So some cells just stop dividing unless they're damaged and they need to repair, like a lot of organs. For example, liver cells don't actively divide all the time, but if there's some kind of damage to the liver cells can start dividing and repair that damage. Similarly, cells in your bones. If you break a bone, then the cell might need to start dividing to fix that break, but otherwise you don't really need your bones to get any longer once you're already as tall as you're going to get. And then there's some cells, like nerve cells, that never really divide again once they're finished sort of forming your nerves. So that's why nerve damage can be really hard to heal and really permanent, because those cells just, they don't want to divide anymore. So when you lose brain cells, you've likely lost those brain cells for good. You know, your liver, you can actually grow back whole chunks of your liver. If you donate some of your liver to someone, like as an organ transplant, the remaining liver can actually sort of grow back, but not so with your brain. Your brain does not grow back. So now let's think about the purpose of cell division. I've definitely given you some hints in the previous slides as to what some of those are, but there's actually several different reasons cells might need to divide. So you can pause and think for a minute, what are some reasons a cell might need to divide? So number 1, growth. When you were conceived, you started off as just one single cell, a fertilized egg. and then that cell divided, and then those 2 cells divided, and then those 4 cells divided, and they divided, and they divided, and they divided again, until eventually, it formed into a baby. So in order to grow from an embryo to a baby to an adult, you need your cells dividing a lot. You just need more cells to get bigger. Next, repair. If cells are damaged or destroyed, if you get hurt, those cells might need to be replaced. So if you cut your finger, you're going to need new cells to divide and fill in that gap to heal that wound. And similar with most wounds, in order to heal wounds, you need to have your cells to be able to divide to replace those cells that have been destroyed. Renewal is another reason. So some cells are just constantly being shed or broken down as they're being used and as you're living your life. So this isn't necessarily an injury, it's just a normal part of life. For example, the outer layer of your skin cells are completely dead. That's why you can do that thing, or if you take a safety pin, you can kind of poke it through a callus on your finger and it doesn't hurt. And that's a protective layer for you, so you don't have your raw live skin cells being exposed to things. But that dead outer layer of skin cells is constantly being shed off and sloughed off, and then new cells are coming up to take their place. And so cells need to divide to replace these cells that are constantly being sloughed off. It's sort of a train of cells that needs to keep dividing and moving up towards the top as the top layer gets sloughed off. Similarly, cells that line your digestive tract are constantly getting kind of broken down and digested a little bit by the environment in there, so those are always needing to be replaced. Cells that are in your hair follicles, your hair keeps growing, and so those cells are always dividing and making new cells, filling up with keratin and then being pushed out to grow your hair. So for some cells, there's just this cycle of cells being lost and new cells coming up to replace them, and cell division is necessary to make those new cells. Now, moving away from you personally, for single-celled organisms like bacteria, for example, division is how they reproduce. So single-celled organisms don't do the whole combining a sperm and egg thing. They just split and make a new bacteria. And then finally, back to my favorite topic, surface area to volume ratio. So remember, cells need to be small to maintain a high surface area to volume ratio. If the cell gets too big, it's too difficult to get the needed materials into the cell and the waste products out of the cell. So if a cell gets too big, it really kind of needs to divide up and split that big cell into smaller cells in order to maintain this surface area to volume ratio. So what happens after the cell divides? Well, for some cells, when the cell divides, it just makes a new copy of itself. So a certain type of cell divides, it makes a new cell of that same type. But there's other cells in you called stem cells. And these cells have the ability to differentiate after they divide. So for an embryo, they have stem cells that can turn into anything. When you're just like a little ball of cells, each of those individual cells has the potential to become whatever kind of cell. As an adult, you have sort of more specific stem cells that can turn into different types of cells, but within a certain category. So for example, in your bone marrow, you have stem cells that can produce various types of blood cells. So when this stem cell in the bone marrow divides, it could differentiate into a white blood cell, which is for your immune system. It could differentiate into a red blood cell, which carry the oxygen and the carbon dioxide. It could differentiate into a platelet, which helps clot the blood or seal off wounds when there's wounds. So this cell can differentiate into all of these different kinds of blood cells after it is divided. And lastly, I want to leave you with just something to consider for next class. What might happen if something goes wrong in the cell cycle? This is obviously a process that needs to be controlled. You need things to be dividing when they're supposed to be dividing. So what if cells start dividing when they're not supposed to, when there's some kind of mistake? You might guess that this would be a bad thing, and you would be correct, but we will learn more about that next class.